At the very beginning of the winter of 1941, when the cold Moscow wind cut to the bone and the front line was threateningly approaching the capital, a certain gentleman named Heine appeared in the occupied territory. He introduced himself to the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, as a staunch anti-Soviet who had fled from the Red oppression. The Germans, naturally, were cautious, but they watched their new acquaintance closely, trying to figure out his true motives. However, Heine was not a random defector as the German officers saw him. Behind this carefully crafted persona was Alexander Petrovich Demyanov, a career officer of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, working under the operational pseudonym Max. Demyanov was not just an executor, but the central figure in a complex, multi-step plan. His origins played a key role in this plan. Alexander Petrovich belonged to an ancient noble family, which, in the eyes of the German command, added weight and credibility to him as an enemy of the Bolsheviks. It was this fact of his biography, carefully emphasized in the legend, that became a kind of pass to the world of the Abwehr's trust. As Lieutenant General Pavel Anatolievich Sudoplatov, one of the leaders of Soviet intelligence, recalled in his memoirs, Demyanov was the ideal candidate. His biography convinced the Abwehr of his sincerity. The transition to the Germans was not a spontaneous decision, but a meticulously planned staging designed to convince the enemy of his sincere anti-Soviet convictions. Demyanov made his way from the Soviet rear to the German positions, carefully following instructions, memorizing answers to possible questions, and thinking through every intonation. His task was not simply to survive in the enemy's lair, but to become one of them, to gain their trust so that he could later use it against the Germans themselves. And he brilliantly accomplished this task, becoming for the Abwehr the very anti-Soviet who would bring them valuable information. In order to finally secure the trust of German intelligence and create a stable channel of disinformation, the Soviet security services needed more than just one defector. They needed an entire network that would confirm his legend and lend weight to the information he passed on. It was then that the idea of creating a fictitious monarchist group called the Throne was born. It was a subtle game played on the expectations of the Abwehr, which was actively searching for internal opposition in the USSR capable of undermining Soviet power from within. Monarchists, with their nostalgia for pre-revolutionary Russia, fit perfectly into this picture. The headquarters of this fictitious organization was located in Moscow, in one of the secret rooms near the Novodevichy convent. The choice of location was not accidental. The ancient convent, with its historical aura associated with Tsarist Russia, was ideal for creating the image of a secret society dreaming of a return to former glory. In this headquarters, under the control of the NKVD, carefully selected and trained people portrayed conspirators. Former nobles, intellectuals, officers, allegedly dissatisfied with Soviet power. They behaved as real opponents of the regime might have behaved, exchanging coded messages, holding secret meetings, discussing plans for future actions. All this was part of a grand spectacle intended exclusively for German eyes. The Germans, as Moscow had hoped, believed in the existence of this extensive network of dissatisfied officers and old intellectuals. For them, this confirmed their own ideas about the internal weakness of the Soviet Union. Alexander Demyanov, acting as a liaison between this organization and the Abwehr, passed on carefully fabricated information. This information, concerning, for example, troop movements, the state of defense enterprises, or the mood in the rear, was not plucked out of thin air. Each piece of disinformation was rigorously checked and approved at the highest level, directly by the Supreme Command Headquarters. This ensured that the Germans would receive information that, on the one hand, would seem plausible and valuable to them, and on the other, would lead them down the wrong track, damaging their own plans. For example, information about certain sabotage allegedly carried out by Throne could be backed up by reports in the Soviet press about fires or accidents that were actually staged or were ordinary incidents but were presented as the result of the activities of conspirators. Thus, step by step, Max and his mythical throne built a bridge of trust across which rivers of lies flowed to Berlin, carefully packaged as truth. After Alexander Demyanov, or Heine, as he was known in the Abwehr, was recruited and firmly established in the trust of German intelligence, he was given the necessary communication equipment. It was a portable radio station and sets of ciphers, everything needed to maintain operational communication with Berlin. The irony of fate was that German equipment designed to gather information against the Soviet Union was now working for Soviet intelligence, becoming a tool for transmitting disinformation to the very heart of the Third Reich. Demyanov did not conduct his communications with Berlin somewhere in the forest or in a remote village, but from a carefully prepared secret apartment in Moscow. This apartment was under round-the-clock surveillance by NKVD officers, who ensured the security of the operation and monitored Max's every move. The atmosphere in such an apartment was tense. The quiet rustle of Morse code, the concentrated faces of the operators, each of whom understood the enormous responsibility. Pavel Sudoplatov, one of the key leaders of the operation, personally supervised each communication session. He recalled that it was a complex but incredibly effective game in which the Soviet side conducted German intelligence like an orchestra. Every message sent to Berlin was carefully checked. It had to be plausible enough not to arouse suspicion, but at the same time contain false information that could mislead the enemy about the Red Army's plans, its forces, or its location. The success of Operation Monastery, and in particular Heine's role in spreading disinformation before the Battle of Stalingrad, raised his standing in the eyes of the Abwehr to unprecedented heights. The Germans considered him not just a valuable agent, but a key source of information in the very heart of the Soviet capital. The Abwehr's trust in Heine was so great that it began to actively use him as a channel for dropping its sabotage groups. They sent paratroopers equipped with radios, codes, money, and weapons to the Moscow region with the sole purpose of establishing contact with Heine and his Prestel organization in order to obtain information from them and coordinate their actions. Each such drop was not a threat to the NKVD, but a new opportunity. As soon as the German paratroopers touched the ground, they immediately fell into preset traps. They were arrested quickly and quietly without even giving them a chance to understand what was happening. All their equipment, especially radios and codes, fell into the hands of Soviet counterintelligence. This had a double effect. First, each captured radio and set of codes expanded the possibilities for radio warfare. Soviet radio operators, using German equipment and ciphers, could now communicate with Berlin on behalf of arrested agents, transmitting even more disinformation or confirming information that had already been transmitted. This made it possible to create new, more complex and convincing deception scenarios. Secondly, each such episode reinforced the myth of the throne. The Germans saw that their agents were successfully establishing contact, transmitting reports, and then disappearing or going underground. In reality, they simply ended up in the hands of the NKVD. This confirmed to the Abwehr the existence and activity of an underground organization, forcing them to waste enormous resources. Imagine how, somewhere in Berlin, Abwehr officers are developing a new operation, planning drop routes, spending time, money, and human resources on preparing saboteurs, training them, and equipping them. And then, after just a few days or weeks, these carefully prepared groups disappear without a trace in the Moscow region, without even having time to complete their mission. And most importantly, the Abwehr never realized that these groups were not simply disappearing, but that their equipment and knowledge were beginning to work against them. This was not just a matter of capturing spies. It was a subtle, multi-level game in which the enemy itself provided the tools for its own deception. The Germans were so blinded by the apparent success of Heine that they continued to throw their people and resources into this bottomless trap, unaware that each of their attempts only strengthened the Soviet intelligence network. In the autumn of 1942, when the fate of Stalingrad hung in the balance and the city had turned into hell on earth, the Soviet command was preparing a counter-offensive designed to change the course of the entire war. This operation, codenamed Uranus, required not only a colossal concentration of forces and resources, but also absolute secrecy. The slightest leak of information could lead to disaster. And this is where Alexander Demyanov, his fictitious organization Throne, and their reliable channel of communication with the Abwehr came into play. The culmination of this intelligence game was carefully planned disinformation passed on to the Germans via Heine on the eve of Operation Uranus. Through channels that the Abwehr considered its own, valuable information was sent to Berlin. According to Throne data, the Red Army's main strike was aimed at Rzhev, not Stalingrad. At that time, the Rzhev direction was indeed an extremely tense section of the front, where fierce battles were taking place, and the Germans could well believe in such a threat. Heine's reports, backed up by other carefully fabricated evidence, convinced the German command of the sincerity of this information. The consequences of this misinformation proved fatal for the Wehrmacht. Believing in the false priority, Hitler's command began to transfer its reserves, tanks, artillery, infantry units, to Moscow, to the Rzhev area, to strengthen the defenses in this sector. This decision had a direct and devastating impact on the situation at Stalingrad. The flanks of Field Marshal Paulus's Sixth Army, already stretched and weakened, were deprived of the necessary reinforcements. Their defenses became even more vulnerable. When, on the 19th of November 1942, Soviet troops began their rapid advance as part of Operation Uranus, it came as a complete surprise to the Germans. Taking advantage of the weakening of the enemy's flanks, the Red Army was able to quickly make a deep breakthrough and close the encirclement around Paulus's 330,000-strong group near Stalingrad. This lie, conveyed through Max, did not simply mislead the Germans. It effectively broke their backbone in the Battle of Stalingrad. The defeat and subsequent surrender of the Sixth Army became a key turning point in the Great Patriotic War, marking the beginning of the Red Army's strategic offensive. Without that disinformation, without that brilliant deception, the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad could have been completely different. It was a real triumph of intelligence, proving that war is waged not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of the enemy. Operation Monastery not only continued after the Battle of Stalingrad, but also underwent further development, demonstrating unprecedented longevity and scale for that time. In 1944, when the Red Army was already advancing confidently westward, liberating Soviet territory, the operation was expanded and given a new code name, Berezino. The goal remained the same: to continue to misinform the enemy, distracting its forces and resources. This time, the scenario was even more daring. The Germans were convinced of the existence of a large group of German soldiers allegedly surrounded in the Belarusian forests after their defeat during Operation Bagration. According to the legend, these 2,000 surrounded soldiers were under the command of the fictional Colonel Scherhorn, who, it was claimed, continued to fight behind Red Army lines and needed help and supplies. This legend was incredibly appealing to the German command. The idea that somewhere in the Soviet rear there were still combat-ready units that could be used for sabotage or rescue seemed too tempting to ignore. And again, thanks to the impeccable work of Max and his curators, the Abwehr believed it. Until 1945, when the war was already coming to an end, Germany regularly sent planes with cargo, food, medicine, ammunition, radios, to the specified areas of Belarus. These planes, of course, landed in the hands of Soviet troops, and their crews were taken prisoner. This operation was of enormous strategic importance. Every flight of a German aircraft into the Belarusian forests meant the diversion of valuable resources, fuel, pilots, transport, from the real needs of the front. In the conditions of total shortage that Germany experienced in the last years of the war, such losses were particularly sensitive. Aircraft that could have been used to deliver supplies to active front lines or for reconnaissance were wasting their resources on supplying a phantom group. It was a brilliant demonstration of how, with the help of a single lie, it was possible to force the enemy to waste its strength and resources, weakening it at crucial moments. Alexander Demyanov, the main character in this long-running game, was awarded the high state award, the Order of the Red Star, for his exploits and invaluable contribution to victory. This award was recognition of his exceptional courage, composure, and professionalism, demonstrated in one of the longest and most successful intelligence operations of the Great Patriotic War. Operation Monastery remains the benchmark for strategic disinformation. Alexander Demyanov, under the leadership of Pseudoplatov, did not simply deceive the Abwehr. He changed history, proving that intelligence and cunning are stronger than brute force.